The air inside the Los Angeles County Courthouse was thick, almost suffocating. Spectators filled the gallery, murmuring amongst themselves as they waited for the proceedings to begin. At the defendant's table, a young man stood with his hands in his pockets, his chin lifted just enough to show he wasn't afraid. Jalen Dawson, 19 years old, accused of grand theft auto and resisting arrest. The charges were serious, but the way Judge Walter Grayson looked at him made it clear. The real trial had nothing to do with the law. Grayson leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming lazily against the polished wood of his desk. He peered at Jalen over the rim of his glasses, his lips twisting into something between a smirk and a sneer. "You think you're some kind of legal expert?" The judge mused, his voice laced with amusement. "This isn't a debate club, kid." A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom. The bailiff, the stenographer, even the prosecutor, they were all in on the joke. Jalen didn't flinch. He wasn't laughing. He had spent years preparing for this moment. Not this exact one, but something like it. He knew the courtroom like the back of his hand. While other kids memorized basketball stats, he memorized case law. While his friends played video games, he played mock trials in his head, arguing imaginary cases with himself. His mother, Denise Dawson, had worked as a paralegal for over 20 years. Jalen had grown up listening to the stories she brought home. How prosecutors cut corners, how judges played favorites, how some defense attorneys barely tried. He had absorbed everything. By the time he was 14, he could break down a trial better than most law students. But none of that mattered to Judge Grayson. To him, Jalen was just another black kid in trouble. The judge let out a bored sigh, flipping open the case file. "Let's make this quick. I have a golf game at 2. Laughter echoed through the gallery. But this time, something shifted. Jalen's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smirk. Because Grayson had just made his first mistake, and the courtroom hadn't even noticed yet. Prosecutor Mitchell Carrington rose from his seat with the air of a man who had already won. His suit was crisp, his tie perfectly knotted, and his voice carried that rehearsed confidence of someone who had delivered the same speech 100 times before. "Your Honor, the state will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the defendant, Jalen Dawson, was caught red-handed in a stolen vehicle." He paused, his eyes flickering toward Jalen. "A 2022 Audi A6 reported missing just hours before his arrest." The crowd in the gallery shifted, whispering among themselves. On the surface, it sounded damning. A stolen car. A chase. Running. Judge Grayson glanced at Jalen over his glasses, then turned back to Carrington. "Go on." The prosecutor walked toward the jury box, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. "The defense may try to convince you that this was all a misunderstanding," Carrington continued, "that Mr. Dawson is some unfortunate victim of circumstance." Then he turned, locking eyes with Jalen for the first time. "But let's be honest. What kind of victim runs from the police?" The tension thickened. Judge Grayson leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand. Jalen didn't blink. Carrington flipped through a stack of papers. "Your Honor, I have here the testimony of Officer Daniel Ruiz, who personally witnessed the defendant behind the wheel before he attempted to flee. The car was confirmed stolen. The arrest was made by the book." Grayson exhaled through his nose, nodding along. "Sounds straightforward to me." For most people in the room, it probably did, but Jalen had spent too many years studying trials not to see the cracks. Still, he stayed silent, watching, waiting. Judge Grayson tapped his gavel lightly. "All right, let's hear the defense's response." He turned to Jalen's lawyer, a public defender named Lisa Thornton, who had barely said 3 words since stepping into the courtroom. She stood up, shifting nervously. "Your Honor, my client—" Jalen placed a hand on her arm. A silent request. She hesitated, then sat back down. And for the first time, Jalen spoke. "I'll be representing myself, Your Honor." The room went completely silent. Grayson stared at him, clearly amused. "You'll what?" Jalen's voice was calm, steady. "I'll be defending myself." A murmur spread through the courtroom. The bailiff's eyebrows shot up. Carrington's smirk faltered for just a second before he let out a sharp laugh. This should be interesting. But no one was laughing when Jalen took his first step forward, because everything was about to change. Jalen let the silence stretch. just long enough to make them uncomfortable. Then he spoke. Your Honor, before I begin, I'd like to confirm something with the prosecution. Carrington raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms. Go ahead. Jalen took a slow step forward. You said Officer Daniel Ruiz personally saw me behind the wheel before I was arrested, correct? Carrington exhaled sharply, already bored. That's right. And that testimony is written in his report? Of course it is. Jalen nodded, then turned to Judge Grayson. Your Honor, I move to dismiss that testimony as evidence. Grayson squinted at him. On what grounds? Jalen pulled his hands from his pockets for the first time and gestured toward the prosecution's table. Because Officer Ruiz never saw me in that car. A flicker of confusion crossed Carrington's face. What are you talking about? Jalen took another step forward. Your Honor, if the court allows me, I'd like to submit a request to verify Officer Ruiz's GPS logs from that night. His voice was calm, methodical. If his report says he witnessed me in the vehicle, then it should match his location history. Then he let the words hang. But I have a feeling it won't. The gallery erupted. Judge Grayson's frown deepened. Carrington hesitated, just for a second. But it was long enough. The jury noticed. The gallery noticed. And most importantly, the judge noticed. Jalen took a quiet breath. He had spent years watching trials, studying prosecutors, learning their tactics. There was one thing he knew without a doubt. If Carrington was confident, he wouldn't be stalling. Judge Grayson sighed, rubbing his temple. Counselor. Carrington cleared his throat. His jaw tightened. Finally, he shook his head. No objections, Your Honor. But the shift had already begun. For the first time, the courtroom wasn't laughing anymore. The air in the courtroom felt different now, no longer filled with mocking laughter, but unease. The once confident prosecutor, Mitchell Carrington, sat stiffly at his table, flipping through his case file as if trying to find something, anything to recover from the shift. But Jalen Dawson knew exactly what he was doing. This wasn't about bravado. This was about control, and he had just taken it. Judge Grayson let out a slow breath, rubbing his temples. He turned toward the prosecutor. Counselor, does the prosecution have any issue with verifying the officer's GPS logs? Carrington hesitated. The pause was small, but it was enough. Jalen had seen it 100 times before while watching trials. Prosecutors only stall when they know something is wrong. Carrington's lips pressed into a thin line before he finally shook his head. No objections, Your Honor. But the damage was already done. Jalen took another step forward, his voice measured. Interesting. He turned toward the jury, letting his words settle. Let's move on. The prosecutor straightened his shoulders, attempting to regain his rhythm. Your Honor, while we wait for those GPS records, the fact remains. He turned toward the jury, flipping a page in his notes. The defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle. Jalen nodded slightly, his expression unreadable. That's true. Carrington's confidence flickered back for a second. Exactly. Which means, but let's talk about that evidence for a second. Jalen's interruption was clean, sharp enough to make Carrington pause. Judge Grayson gestured for him to continue. The prosecution wants you to believe that because my fingerprints were found in the car, that means I stole it. Jalen turned toward the jury. That's the story they're selling. But let's think about this logically. He took a breath. Let's say you walk into a department store and try on a jacket. A few jurors tilted their heads, curious. You put your hands in the pockets, maybe zip it up, then you put it back on the rack and walk out. Jalen paused, looking at them one by one. A few hours later, someone shoplifts that same jacket. His voice stayed calm, unwavering. Would the fact that your fingerprints are on it mean you stole it? Silence. One of the jurors, a middle-aged man in a navy suit, shifted uncomfortably. Someone in the gallery murmured under their breath. Jalen didn't let them recover. The car in question was parked outside a 7-Eleven hours before the alleged theft. Jalen turned toward Judge Grayson. I was inside that store with 3 friends, and yes, when we walked past the car, I leaned against it. I even opened the door because it was already unlocked. His voice never wavered. I didn't think much of it, didn't take the car, didn't drive it. Didn't steal anything from inside. He let that sit for a second, then in a voice that cut through the silence like a scalpel, "Does touching something make you a criminal?" Carrington cleared his throat, flipping through his notes. For the first time he was searching. Jalen had shifted the perspective. The jury wasn't just listening anymore. They were thinking. And doubt was creeping in. Jalen wasn't finished. "And while we're on the topic," he continued, "let's talk about how that fingerprint analysis was done." He turned back to Judge Grayson. "Your Honor, was the forensic specialist from this case subpoenaed to testify?" Grayson blinked, caught off guard by the question. He glanced toward Carrington. The prosecutor hesitated, then reluctantly, "No." Jalen gave a small nod, as if that was all he needed to hear. "So let me get this straight," he said, turning back toward the jury. "The state is using forensic evidence to try and convict me, but they didn't think it was necessary to bring in the actual specialist who processed that evidence? No chance for me to cross-examine? No opportunity to ask about the chain of custody?" His voice stayed smooth. "No way for us to challenge the accuracy of the analysis?" Carrington's jaw tightened. Jalen simply shrugged. "Interesting." Judge Grayson let out a low sigh, pinching the bridge of his nose. He looked at Jalen, but this time the arrogance was gone. The judge was realizing something. This case was not the easy win he had assumed it would be. Jalen took a slow step forward. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady but firm, "I'd like to enter into evidence an official statement from the owner of the vehicle." Judge Grayson frowned. "The owner?" Jalen nodded. "Yes, Mr. Raymond Whitaker, the registered owner of the stolen Audi, provided a statement to the police that for some reason was never submitted in the prosecution's filings." Carrington stiffened. Jalen saw it. He knew what was coming. He turned toward the prosecutor. "Do you recall what Mr. Whitaker told officers the night his car was reported stolen?" Carrington's fingers clenched around his pen. He knew exactly what was about to happen. Jalen didn't wait for him to answer. Instead, he pulled out a printed transcript from his file and read aloud. "I left my car running when I ran inside the gas station. Some kid must have jumped in and taken off, but it wasn't the guy you arrested. I saw the kid, and he was white." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Jalen held up the document. "That's from the original police report, the same report the prosecution conveniently never mentioned." He turned back to Judge Grayson. "The arresting officer omitted this from his testimony. The prosecution ignored it. And yet they want this jury to believe that I, someone who doesn't even match the description of the real thief, was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt?" Carrington stepped forward, scrambling. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant. The defendant was caught in possession of the vehicle." But Jalen shook his head. "No, I wasn't." His voice didn't rise, but it cut through the courtroom with sharp precision. "I was arrested blocks away from where the vehicle was abandoned, walking home after getting snacks with my friends." He locked eyes with the jury. "I wasn't in the car. I wasn't near the car. I wasn't running from anything." His next words were soft, but they landed like a punch. "The only thing tying me to this case is bad police work and assumptions." Judge Grayson let out a slow breath, rubbing his temple. The case was unraveling fast, and everyone knew it. Jalen turned back to the jury. "The real suspect got away that night. The officers found a black kid in the same general area and decided that was close enough. That's what this case is really about." Silence. Judge Grayson cleared his throat. "Does the prosecution have anything further?" Carrington was stiff, his face flushed. "No, Your Honor." And just like that, Jalen knew he had won. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Jalen stood tall, his heartbeat steady. He had presented every fact with precision, exposing the gaps, the contradictions, the outright negligence in the case against him. And now all that remained was the judge's ruling. Judge Walter Grayson sat at the bench, his fingers interlocked as he studied Jalen carefully. There was no smirk now, no amusement, only a slow, dawning realization that the young man standing before him was not what he had assumed. Jalen had done the impossible. He had turned a case that was meant to be an easy conviction into a reckoning. Judge Grayson exhaled sharply, leaning forward. Case dismissed. A beat of stunned silence. Then chaos. Half the courtroom erupted, some in disbelief, some in quiet relief. The murmurs in the gallery swelled into a low hum of conversations, reporters in the back furiously scribbling notes. Jalen didn't move right away. He let the moment settle. He let reality sink in for everyone. Judge Grayson gripped his gavel tightly, his expression unreadable. But Jalen saw it, the flicker of something different in the judge's eyes. Recognition, maybe, or regret. It was hard to tell. Finally, as Jalen turned to leave, Grayson spoke again. Mr. Dawson. Jalen stopped but didn't turn. There was a hesitation, the smallest crack in Grayson's authoritative tone. You should consider law school. Jalen smirked. He didn't need to consider it. He was already on his way. Outside the courthouse. As Jalen stepped outside, the bright Los Angeles sun hit his face, blinding him for a moment, but he didn't even have time to adjust, because the reporters were waiting. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust forward like weapons. Jalen, did you know the judge would dismiss the case? What are you going to do next? How does it feel to outmaneuver a seasoned prosecutor? Jalen ignored them all. He wasn't interested in the spectacle. This wasn't about proving how smart he was. This was about something bigger, and he had no intention of letting this moment get reduced to a viral headline. At the bottom of the courthouse steps, his mother, Denise Dawson, was waiting. She stood with her arms crossed, watching him. For a long moment, she just looked at him. Then finally, she shook her head and let out a breath. Boy, you scared me half to death, Jalen chuckled, scratching the back of his head. Had to take a risk, Ma. She stared at him a second longer, then pulled him into a tight hug. You always were the stubborn one. Jalen laughed, hugging her back. But as he pulled away, his eyes drifted across the street. Judge Grayson was standing by his car, watching him. His posture was different now. The arrogance? Gone. His expression? Something closer to reflection. Jalen held his gaze for a second, then turned away. The judge had learned something today, but Jalen had bigger things to do. The lesson. The courtroom was just one battle. Jalen had won today, but this wasn't about one case. This was about all of them. Because how many other trials had played out just like this? How many people had been convicted, not because of real evidence, but because of bias, because of shortcuts, because the system cared more about closing cases than finding the truth? Jalen had the knowledge to fight back, but what about the ones who didn't? This wasn't just about proving himself, it was about making sure other people didn't have to go through this. This courtroom wouldn't be the last one he stood in, but next time, he wouldn't be the defendant. He'd be the attorney, and when that day came, he wouldn't be the only one. Because if there was one thing he knew for certain, the system wasn't built to protect people like him, so he was going to change it, piece by piece, case by case. And when he did, the system would never see it coming.